Okay, guys, so let's discuss the question. So if we look at question 2.6 and we look at the additional information, let's start with point number 1. So they tell us the total of the debtors control column in the debtors allowance journal of 1,200 was posted to the debit side of the debtors control account. Okay, so normally our debtors allowance journal, how you have to go about this is normally our debtors allowance journal, when we capture it to our debtors control account, which side of the control account would you post it to? Okay, so let me just repeat that. If you've got the debtors column in our debtors allowance journal, to which side of the debtors control account would you normally post that entry to? Would it be to the debit or the credit side? Okay, to the credit side. That's correct. So what they did now is instead of putting it to the credit side, they've actually done it to the debit side. So now we've put it on the wrong side. Now, how do we correct it if we've put it on the debit side, but it should have actually been on the credit side? So we should have had a credit of 1,200, but now we've accidentally captured it as a debit of 1,200. How do I correct it to get to the correct amount? Okay, so to repeat that, they debited 1,200. What do I need to do to correct it to be a credit of 1,200 instead of a debit of 1,200? Okay, so Donovan says we need to credit it with 2,400, and that's correct. So let me just explain how it works. So what they did is they initially put, just gonna unhind here. So they initially put 1,200, which was incorrect. Now to net it out, we would initially have to put 1,200 there to get it back to 0. Okay. But because of the fact that it shouldn't be 0, it should actually be 1,200 on the credit side. I will have to add another 1,200 on the credit side to get a net of 1,200. But now to correct this balance in here, I will only show that 2,400 on the credit to correct the mistake. Okay, so that's how you correct the first entry. So the second entry, they tell you a credit note was issued for 100 Rand had not been recorded at all. Okay, so if they tell you a credit note was issued, are we looking at a debtor or are we looking at a creditor? If we're talking about a credit note was issued, are we talking about a debtor or are we talking about a creditor? What account do you think will be affected? Okay, so Tebe says it's a debtor, and that's correct, Tebe. Okay, now remember, if we issue, because this question is written from our business perspective, If we issue a document, it means we've given it to a third party, which means that it is our debtor. If we receive a credit note, it means it is the creditor. So that is the lingo that you need to look out for. If it's issued, it is our business that have given that document to a third party. If we received it, it is our third party that have provided it to the business, and then it would be a creditor. So because in this case we are talking about a credit note that was issued, we would be looking at the debtor account. So it was for 100 Rand and it has not been recorded at all. Now, because it has not been recorded at all in our books, it would affect both our debtors control account as well as our debtors list. Now, if we issue a credit note to our debtor, will we debit or credit their account? Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. If we issue a credit note to our debtor, will we debit or credit their account? That's correct, Hebe. We will credit it. Because we are issuing a credit note, we are actually decreasing the account. So what we will have to do is we credit both the control account as well as the debtors list because that transaction has not been recorded at all. So it hasn't been reflected in either one of the two listings. Okay, let's move on to point number 3. A settlement discount granted to a debtor was erroneously credited to a creditor's account in the general journal and posted as such. So what happened is we provided a discount to our debtor, but instead of taking it to debtor's control and the debtor's account, we accidentally took it to the creditor's control account and the creditor's account. They tell you the VAT inclusive amount of the discount was 228 Rand. Okay, so let's start with the first question. When we give discount to a debtor, is that amount inclusive of VAT or exclusive of VAT? Okay, so let me repeat the question. If we provide discount to a debtor, is the amount that we write it off for the discount, does that include VAT or does it exclude VAT? Okay, so Pamela thinks it's exclusive of VAT. Tebe says it includes VAT. Okay, so let's state it this way. So Pamela, the exclusive of VAT amount would generally go to your sales account. And then we would reflect the VAT separately. Remember our debtors control account, because it shows the total amount they owe us, it is always inclusive of VAT. So please just make a note of that, and the rest of you guys as well, because I know some of you would have had a similar answer. So just remember, when we look at the control account or the debtors listing, it is always inclusive of VAT. The VAT component is only excluded when we look at our income statement or your statement of profit and loss account, where we look at what was the actual profit for the year because of the fact that we would have removed the VAT that we had to pay over to SARS. But our debtor needs to pay that VAT to us so that we can pay it to SARS. So that's why the debtor's amount will be inclusive of VAT, because they owe us both our sales value as well as the VAT that we have to pay to SARS at the end of the day. Okay, so what this means is, because we now accidentally took it to the creditor's account, we will first have to remove it out of the creditor's account. Now, what we would have done is, because we thought it going to the creditor's account, we would have credited the account, because normally we would credit the debtor's account to reduce the debtor's balance. So we would have credited the creditor's account. But now to reverse that transaction that incorrectly went to the creditor's account, we will now have to debit it to make it a zero. So there was a credit balance that shouldn't have been there. So now we debit it to make it a zero. But then to correct it in our debtor's account, we need to reflect the discount, which is a credit. Okay. This is the double entry system. So for every debit, there's a credit. So I've credited the debtor's control. I would have debited the creditor's control. I would have credited the debtor's listing, and I would have debited the creditor's listing in this scenario to correct it. So I'm literally transferring it from one account to the correct account. Okay, so that's transaction number 3. Transaction number 4, the debtor's control column in the cash book receipts was overcast by 350 Rand. Okay, now remember your debtor's control column, we take the full column to our... Mabali, do you have a question? I just see an N. Okay. So number 4. So because the debtors column in our cash book receipts was overcast, it means the balance actually had 350 Rand too much in it. Okay. We said we take that total and we take it to the debtors control account to do the control account in our general ledger. Whereas we take the individual line items in our cash book receipt to the individual debtors listing. So if the total was incorrect, it would only affect the debtors control account. It will not affect our debtors listing. Okay, so for that reason, normally when we get a receipt for your debtors, we would reduce our debtors control with that receipt amount by crediting it. Now, because we credited it with 350 Rand too much, now we will have to debit it with that same 350 Rand to neutralize the mistake. Okay, everyone still okay up to here? Do you have any questions? Okay, so let me just repeat. Do you have any questions on item 1 to 4 that we've covered so far? Do I need to repeat anything for anyone? Are you still okay with what I've explained? Okay, so I see Tebe is fine. The rest of you guys, are you okay? Is there anything I need to re-clarify, or are you happy so far? Okay, so I know 2 people are fine with it. What about the rest of you? Just give me a thumbs up, a smiley face, a yes, a no. Just want to know you guys are still alive. Okay, if there's anything that you want me to clarify, please just pop a message in the chat function. But I see everyone's okay so far, so let's continue then. Okay, so point number 5, they tell you the credit note received for 700 Rand, including VAT, was erroneously journalized and posted as an original invoice. Okay, now what they did is it was a credit note we received. So we received it from our creditor, but instead of showing it as a credit note, we actually went and captured it as an invoice. So what we did is instead of decreasing our account, we actually went and increased our creditor account. Now, if you put it to the wrong side of the account, to correct it, you have to double up that amount to get it to the correct number on the opposite side. So it's similar to transaction number 1. So my question is, based on this information, will it only affect our creditors listing, or will it also affect our creditors control account? So will it only affect one of the two, or will it affect both? So you can either say one of two, or you can say both. Okay, so let me just repeat this. If we captured a credit note as an invoice by mistake, will it affect both our creditors control account and creditors listing, or will it only affect one of the two? Okay, so Tebe says it will affect both. Donovan says both. Yeah, so you guys are absolutely correct. So because of the fact that we captured it to the incorrect journal, it would have been captured incorrectly in both the creditor's control account in the total as well as in the debtor's listing. So we will have to go correct it in both our creditors control as well as creditors list. Now, because we captured it as an invoice, we would have initially credited that account with the 700 Rand, where we should have in fact debited it with the 700 because it was a credit note. So because of that, I told you to correct that amount, you would double up that amount, similar to transaction one. So you would initially capture the 700 to correct the mistake, and then you would capture the additional 700 to rectify what it should have been. So in this case, that's how we got to the 1,400 Rand. Then if we move on to point number 6, a debtor's individual balance of 2,000 Rand was transferred to the account in the creditor's ledger. The entry was correctly made in the subsidiary journals and ledgers, but in the general ledger, the debtor's control account was debited while the creditor's control was credited. Okay, so what they're saying is we transferred a balance from the one account to another account. Now the sub-ledgers is the individual debtor and creditors ledgers. There we've accounted for it correctly. But what they're telling you is we incorrectly debited it to our debtor's control account where we should have credited it. So we should have taken it out of debtor's control by crediting it, and then we should have, instead of crediting creditor's control, we should have debited it. So what we have to do here is we have to do the opposite, and to fix it, we have to double up similar to the previous transaction. But because the subsidiary journals are correct, we will only impact the debtor's control account and the creditor's control account with the 4,000 Rand. Okay, so it was only the consolidated information that was incorrectly captured and not the individual accounts. Okay, so that is number 6 for you. Number 7, we say the total of 512 Rand on an original invoice was posted to the creditor's individual account in the creditor's ledger as 521. So what you can see is in the individual creditor's account, we made a typo or a handwriting error in this case. So we wrote 521 instead of 512. So what will we have to correct in this instance? Will it be the creditor's control account or the creditor's listing? And with what amount do we correct it? Okay, so let me just repeat it. If we made a typo in our individual creditor's account, will that error affect the control account or just the creditor's listing? Okay, so Tebe says the creditors listing. Okay, so that's correct because we only made a mistake in their individual account. So what we did is we said it was 521 instead of 512. So if you go do the calculation, it's a 9 Rand difference, which we credited it with too much. So in this case, we would then debit it with 9 Rand. You'll see here at the top, it's the 521 less the 512 will give you 9 Rand. So we then debit the creditors listing with that 9 Rand just to correct our transposition error. Okay, then point number 8, a duplicate credit invoice. Now, a duplicate credit invoice means it is an invoice that we issue to our debtor. So we always have a duplicate. So that means we are looking at your debtor's account. Displays a VAT inclusive amount of 420 Rand, and we only have standard rated goods were sold. Now, the reason they tell you that is so that you know there weren't any zero rated that could potentially impact that amount. And this was captured in error to the creditors into creditors journal instead of the debtors journal and posted as such. So what happened is we put it in the creditors journal instead of the debtors journal. Okay, now do you think we will capture this to our debtors control account, debtors listing, creditors control account, creditors listing? What do you think? Or will it affect all of them? Okay, so this transaction number 8, do you think it will affect only debtors, only creditors, or do you think it will affect all 4 accounts? If you're unsure, you're also welcome to indicate that in the chat function. So let me repeat the question. We've got a duplicate credit invoice of 420 Rand, which we captured to the creditor's journal instead of the debtor's journal. So my question is, will it only affect debtors? Will it only affect the creditor's account, or will it affect all 4 accounts? Okay, so Tebe says all 4, and that's correct. So what would have happened is when you did it in the creditor's journal, it would have gone to your creditor's control account as well as your creditor's listing. But it should have actually gone to your debtor's control account and your debtor's listing. So in this instance, it will actually affect all 4 accounts. Now, what would have happened is we would have initially, let's quickly see, the 420. So we should have debited our debtors control and debtors listing initially. Okay, so let's see what we should have done. Okay, so debtors control, debtors list. That is what the amount should have been. But what would we have done with the creditors? Because we captured it as a creditors invoice, we would have actually credited the creditors account and creditors listing and not debited because we accidentally thought it's a creditor's invoice as opposed to a debtor's invoice. So to correct that mistake, we would also have to debit your creditors control and your creditors listing. Okay, so in this instance, there isn't a debit and a credit if you look at this on both sides because of the fact to correct the error initially we had to debit the control account to neutralize the credit that was initially captured, and then we would have debited the correct accounts in this instance. Okay, number 9, an original credit invoice, credit note totaling 1,000 was correctly entered into your creditor's allowance journal. Okay, so that is the original credit note is what we received from our creditors. Okay, so that was initially correctly accounted for in the creditors allowance journal. So that means the total would have been correct. But when posting the entry to the creditors individual account, we only captured 100 Rand. So in this instance, will we correct this in the creditors control account or the creditors list? So number 9, will we correct it in the creditors control account or in the creditors list? Okay, so Tebe says the creditors list, and that's correct. Because of the fact that the creditors allowance journal was correct, the total that went to the creditors control account would have been correct. And the error was only in the individual account, which means we would debit the creditors listing because of the fact that it's a credit note, so it would have reduced our balance. Okay. Then the last item. A check counterfoil for check issued to a creditor shows the correct amount of 6,000. So check counterfoils goes to our cash book payments journal. The amount was correctly entered into the cash book payments, but only 600 was entered into the creditor's individual account. So here we've got a similar issue. We've accounted for it correct in the journal. So the creditor's control account would have been correct. But when we captured it into our individual creditors account, we made a little typo. So that means we would also have to debit the creditors listing, but that would be the difference between the 6,000 and the 600, which is 5,400. Okay, so now we've done each and every individual transaction. Now the last step that you guys have to do is now we have to plus or minus the amounts. So let's start with the debtors control account. Which column will we add to the balance and which column will we deduct? So you can just indicate a plus sign with whether it's a debit or a credit, and a minus sign whether it's the debit or the credit column that we will add. Okay, so let me just repeat that. If we look just at the debtors control account section, what will we add to the balance? What will we subtract to the from the balance? Okay, what side of our debtors control account increases our debtors? What side decreases our debtors? You guys understand the question? Okay, so TB says the debit side will be positive. Okay, so for the plus, we would add all of the debit sides. Now in this scenario, that would be 770. Okay, so I just did the form. Okay, let me just show the totals here at the bottom. So I've already added the totals here at the bottom just to help me do this calculation. Okay, so we would have added the 770 and we would have subtracted the 6,728 because credit sides decrease our debtors account. And then our new balance would be as follows. We would take the 11,000, we would add the 770, we will subtract the 6728 to get to a new balance of 5,042 Rand. Okay, we would do exactly the same with the debtors listing. So your debit side would increase it, your credit side would decrease it, and we would add it together. Now, what we need to do is make sure that your debtors control balance and your debtors listing is exactly the same. So you'll see here at the bottom, there is no variance between the two. So we've reconciled it. We know we've captured it correctly now. Okay, then on the creditors control account, we know that creditors increase on the credit side. So we would add the credit side, we would subtract the debit side. In this case, the credit side had a 0 amount, the debit side had a 6,048 Rand. To get to the new balance, we would take the 16,000, we would add 0, we would subtract the 6,048 to get to a balance of 10,072 Rand. And we would do exactly the same with the creditors listing. And then we would compare the creditors control account with the creditors list, and you'll see they're exactly the same. There is no difference. Okay, so that is the last step. That's how we know we have reconciled the information correctly. Okay, so that's question 2.6. So for homework, I want you to go through question 2.5 and 2.7. Now, 2.5 is similar to what we've done in question 2.4. That is just to help you work through a question on your own. And then question 2.7, on the other hand, is where it's a long question. So that's where they do both debtors and creditors simultaneously. So that's where you can expect to see both. Then there's also ICE Activity 2 on BC Learn. It is due for the 23rd of August. And then do you guys have any questions on what we've done today?